This is a place for us die-hard fans of 3D, where we look exclusively at 3D Blu-rays, not to review the film itself, but to have a close-up look at the film's 3D, with some thoughts about how well it works. And today we're looking at Ron Howard's 2015 film, In the Heart of the Sea. This one's got an aspect ratio of 1.85 to 1, and it was post-converted into 3D. There are some post-converted films where the 3D was an afterthought, which sometimes can work well and sometimes less so, and there are some post-converted films where the 3D was planned for throughout the production, which obviously has a much better chance of achieving successful results. And to my eyes, and I could of course be wrong, but I think this film was definitely not just shot with a post-conversion in mind, but also with a very keen eye for its 3D. The film is mostly set at sea, and it takes place in the 1820s, so that means we're on ships with masts and sails and miles of ropes. In other words, we're in a great location for good 3D compositions, and so ropes are, I think, the film's great 3D prop. There are a whole load of them, offering various types of 3D composition, from having a load of them across the Z-axis stretching back into the frame, to having them frame characters. They do a great job of building volume and depth into the multiple views on the ship's deck. And it's depth that this film's 3D is all about. There are very few obvious pop-out moments in this movie, and being a film about whaling, the fact that it never does the obvious shot of hurling a harpoon towards the camera and out of the screen, I think tells you all you need to know about how the 3D here is of the more sophisticated variety and absolutely avoids any accusations of being gimmicky. That's not to say nothing pops out at all. There are a few times when something emerges a good way out of the screen, and more than once it's one of those ropes, so it's never a throw-it-in-your-face type of pop-out. This is tasteful 3D, even if these ropes really do feel like they're coming a long way out of the screen. Or this one does something really nice, which is that those blobs of water on the camera's lens are placed at about screen level, so it's about the part of the rope that's in shadow here that feels like it's sticking right into the camera. With all of the other views on the ship, both out on the deck and below deck, there's a strong sense of depth, thanks to the high-quality 3D, which is consistently clear and noticeable, and very well done. It would probably be a little bit too simplistic and cliched to say that it makes you feel like you're on board the ship, but the 3D really does give you a much better feel for what it would be like to be on the ship than 2D can do. There's a great view through a porthole, if that's what a ship's circular window is still called when it's placed horizontally rather than vertically, looking up at the mast. It's another one of the film's quite arty shots, I think, and it's another unusual view where the 3D works really well. As well as that mast there, the film always does a good job of showing people behind glass, like Melville here, and stuff like this is great. It's not at all showy 3D, but it's very atmospheric. I think there was only one shot that maybe didn't look quite right, and that was also behind glass, this oil lamp. The guy's face on the right looks to be in the correct space behind it, and so does his hand on the left, but the bit that he's lighting does look like it's sitting in the same space as the glass, and that's really the only negative that I've got with the 3D in this film. There are quite a few times where there are water drops on the lens, which are always placed into very clear 3D space, so I wonder if this is a case of making the best of a bad job. In other words, was the water on the lens a mildly annoying result of filming in the water, but since they were there, they could give the 3D something fun to do? Or possibly, those water drops never existed in the first place, but were added digitally to enhance the effect? I don't know, maybe it's a bit of both, but either way, they look great here in 3D. Another really strong pop-out has a slightly strange effect, and that's this pole. So this is coming a good way out of the screen, but not only that, because there's quite a bit of left-right eye conflict where it's breaking the frame, that, combined with the amount of negative parallax, really does sort of make it feel for a moment like you're being poked in the eye. Also, if someone's making a 3D film, whatever the subject and setting, there's a good chance that they'll shove a gun out of the screen at some point, and this film manages to do that, and to do it very well. I would say that my only real gripe with this film is the lack of time that any shot is given. It's certainly not rapid-fire editing, but it does feel like there are very few shots that last for any great length of time. In terms of selling the atmosphere and story, that may be exactly the right way to do it, but as ever, from a 3D point of view, I do think shots need maybe a little bit longer than they're usually given here to be as effective as they can be. And that's not to knock the quality of the 3D here, because this is an excellent conversion, which was done by Prime Focus, by the way. It almost feels like they were in a hurry to tell a fairly epic story, and I'd have certainly happily stuck with an hour longer version of the film, especially if it slowed down its editing just a tiny bit. That view we saw of the pole shows something else that's done quite a lot in this film, and that's a close-up view. There are quite a lot of these, most of which feel consciously stylish. They're all put into very good 3D, like the candle here, and even better is the little ship in a bottle, where those light reflections on the bottle are far in the foreground, so that places the ship a nice long way behind them. The 3D is very well done with these objects, all looking extremely solid. Same with this bone with its engraved saucy lady. I guess back in the 1820s that passed for porn, and these guys were away at sea for over a year or more, so I'm sure they needed quite a lot of these little engravings. And speaking of three-dimensional close-ups, another thing that the film does excellently is to create a totally believable sense of solidity to characters' faces when we see them in close-up. These look spot on, and they're done better than in lots of natively shot 3D films. And they're faces with plenty of character in them, sort of often salty facial hair, faces with stories behind them, which, as much as that's implied by the actor's expression, I do think that the 3D helps to bring even more life to it. So I think I said at the top that I reckon this film looks like the 3D was given a lot of thought whilst it was being shot, and that's because the framing often looks like it's going out of its way to look good in 3D, like these jars or lamps or whatever they are hanging down from the ceiling. They do a great job of framing the shot three-dimensionally, and they're nicely kept in the frame whilst the camera's moving about too. And as well as the ship's structure, there's a house that looks like it was built to look good in 3D, with all this framework of sticks and poles around the place, and even the rail out in the front there looks very deliberately put in the shot to help give three-dimensional depth to it. Cameras moving through a doorway, I think, can create a feeling of something significant happening in the room into which we've moved, and I think the 3D can emphasise that feeling, which is what it does here as Chris Hemsworth goes in to talk about what will be a fairly momentous decision about his next job. I think I said that the entire film is very obviously three-dimensional all the way through. It's definitely not one of those where you occasionally wonder whether the 3D's eased up a bit from time to time. That said, there is the odd long shot of a ship at sea, and these aren't hyper-stereo views, so in these instances the view is effectively flat, but the whole thing is placed sufficiently deeply into positive parallax that your screen gives a nice window framing effect to what is always a really beautifully photographed view. There are times when the long shot of the ship is seen from sufficiently low down that the ocean in the foreground is close enough to exist in quite strong 3D space, like here where that swell is very pleasingly in much closer 3D space than the ship. And similar to that view of the sea, there's a shot that I always love in 3D films, and that's where the camera is low to the ground to show a flat plane stretching deep into the frame. I'm not sure if this view would normally be filmed from pretty much down in a puddle on the ground, but doing it this way creates loads of depth. There's actually another version of that flat plane stretching out deep into the frame, and it's one of my favourite pieces of 3D in the film, and that's a view of the whale just under the surface. So it's the view up to the surface at a shallow angle that creates the effect, and it's fantastic. Another version of it, also a little bit unusual, is in another one of the film's close-ups that achieves the same sort of effect on a much smaller scale, and that's this view of Melville scribbling away. Perhaps he's wondering whether he should begin his novel with "Call Me Ishmael," again with loads of depth stretching out to Brendan Gleeson there in the background. There are lots of great views under the water, as you'd hope, and oceans can often look like empty places when films take us beneath the waves, but this one does a superb job of keeping things interesting underwater, like a shot looking up at the boat passing over where there's already some really good depth up through the water to the boat, but the 3D looks excellent here with loads of those dolphins swimming around at various heights. The underwater bubbles in this film look very good in 3D too, and there are quite a few scenes with these, as people tend to end up in the water probably a little bit more often than they'd ideally like, but it serves us well, with them all being placed into really solid 3D space, giving loads of depth and volume to these shots. And out of the water, there are several other views looking up where the 3D is very strong and effective, like the sails here, where the 3D gives a feel of how high up the mast is, and that view is even stronger, obviously, when we're up there looking back down from the mast or in the rigging, and whilst the 3D helps to make these views look like pretty precarious and scary places to be, by the time this film's done, you'll be looking back to the glory days of how safe and easy things were when you were perched high above the ship. On the subject of precarious moments, here's a sequence for MCU fans where Thor is dangling Spider-Man over the side of the ship, and the 3D here is as strong and powerful as you can imagine from this 2D still. Poor old Tom Holland, who plays the younger version of Nickerson, the haunted old man we meet at the beginning of the film, has a bit of a tough time in this story, which is presented as the whole reason for the genesis of Moby Dick. Like here he is again being lowered into the inside of a whale to scoop out the last drops of oil, and the 3D really helps to give you not just a feel of the space, but it also does that other trick that I think 3D sometimes does, which is to heighten other senses. In this case, I'm sort of convinced that the 3D, in fairness, along with Holland's expression, helps you to feel how smelly it is inside the poor dead creature. And very obviously, we don't just see whales from the inside, and like those dolphins earlier, there are fantastic underwater shots of several whales where the 3D depth is used really well, with there being whales and the boat above at various different depths. There's a few other 3D films have used effectively, like in The Finest Hours, for example, where the camera is half in and half out of the water, and there are a few of these views in the film, and I think these just look so much better in 3D than flat. Here's a bit of maybe slightly overdone composition where even in close-up, Ben Wishaw's face is framed by various things in 3D space in front of him, and I'm not sure how to read that from a storytelling point of view, but from a basic 3D point of view, it definitely makes the shot more interesting. And speaking of shots from a storytelling point of view, there's an almost comically obvious piece of symbolism in this close-up, which, like pretty much every shot in the film, has a very good feeling of depth about it, even if it does bring to mind the shot of the orca in Jaws, as seen sailing away framed within the close-up of a shark's jaws. That shot actually makes a bit more sense than this one, maybe, as I think a shark is likely to get you with its teeth, whereas whales are less known for actually eating you, as far as I'm aware. And as far as this film tells us, being eaten by a whale isn't necessarily the nastiest thing that can happen to you. So just a very quick word about the film itself. This is set in the whaling community of the 1820s, and I suppose the first thing to address is the subject matter, because the wholesale slaughter of these majestic giant marine mammals is something that to most modern sensibilities is fairly abhorrent. But the film deals with that very well, I think, almost having its cake and eating it in a way, as it does a good job of setting up the different age in which this takes place, when whaling was a perfectly acceptable way of life, but it also manages to put in some scenes where the monstrosity of the act is given some consideration. I mentioned Jaws a moment ago, which is one of my all-time favourite films, and this film tells the apparently true story of the events that led to Herman Melville writing Moby Dick, which of course played its own part in shaping Peter Benchley's novel over 100 years later. So you could say that without the events depicted in this film, there'd be no Jaws, and then again, without Spielberg's Jaws, there'd be no In the Heart of the Sea, which is a nice sort of circular thing. Anyway, I really like In the Heart of the Sea. Whilst I went into it knowing the background of the Melville thing, I hadn't realised the extent of the way events unfolded into a full survival at sea story. So the tale being told here offered quite a bit more than I expected. It's a gorgeous looking film, and I think it's maybe Ron Howard's most stylish looking film. Like Mel Gibson's Fletcher Christian in The Bounty 30 years earlier, Chris Hemsworth is a second in command with a wiser head than his captain, along with an in-check Australian accent that maybe sometimes wrestles with the accent he's doing. But irrespective of that, I thought he was on good form along with the rest of the cast. I've heard some people complain about the effects work, but as well as being stylish, this is quite a stylised film, and I thought the effects all worked really well. It's a little bit like The Finest Hours in that it's a fairly serious seafaring film with plenty of straight-faced action, and maybe not an obvious choice for a 3D release, but this is an excellent conversion of a film that I think was made for 3D, and I would definitely strongly recommend this for anyone's 3D Blu-ray collection. So I hope you found this in some way useful, and if so, I hope you'll join me again soon for another 3D Blu-ray review. Until then, thanks for looking in on this one. Cheers for now. Bye-bye.